Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast in 4K. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host,
Andrew. Hey, Bills. How are we today?
We're good, Andrew. We are always good when we're doing the podcast, my friend.
And in 4K.
And in 4K. Although we've done a few episodes in 4K, I just thought I'd...
Yeah. We were just reviewing some of the footage earlier and it's looking pretty good.
It is looking pretty good, and I must
see all the wrinkles on camera now, Bills.
We said that last week, I think it was. It's they're the laugh lines.
Okay.
They're the good wrinkles. Anyway, Andrew, what are we talking to everybody about today?
Yeah, so today, Bills, we had a question come in from one of our listeners, Steve. So the context of it is basically the question is, I'm young, I've been thinking about my super, and want to know some of the basics around what I should be considering when I'm thinking about my superannuation.
I think this is a really interesting question. I had a conversation with a client during the week, a younger client, and I spoke to her about some of the areas that we could provide some support and some advice around. And one of the things that I did mention is superannuation, and that really forms a lot of the basis of kind of where we start when we're putting a financial strategy together. And she was of the opinion that, she's got her super, there's not a lot in there, there's not much happening, and she doesn't need to look at it or have it reviewed. And this is kind of along the context of what we're talking about or going to talk about today. And I actually said to her, respectfully, you're incorrect. This is the time that you should be paying attention because, forget about where you're invested, forget about what it's invested in, the cost of the fund, all of that sort of stuff that we hear in the media. I'm like, in its simplest form, if you maintain the status quo in terms of where you're invested, the rate of return that you're getting, and you work for a 40-year-odd career, where are you going to end up? Okay, great. Is that enough? Is it too much? Is it too little? If it is too little, which in most cases that's what we tend to find, what is it that you need to do? And are you not better off knowing that now when you've got time to be able to do that? And she actually, at the end of it, she was really thankful that I sort of brought that to her attention because she's like, I actually never thought about it like that.
I think it's really common as well. I mean, if we sort of consider what the average client is usually like, the average person kind of says, or thinks about their superannuation as, yep, great, have a fund, got a super fund, it's kind of my money, but it's kind of not, so don't really care about it. So Steve, commend you on the fact that you're young and you're thinking about super because you think about compound interest and you think about getting it right from the early stages. It has a hugely significant difference to where you ultimately end up on. And so the earlier that you start working through it, the earlier that you start thinking about your superannuation and thinking about not just the product and the investments, which are important and we will talk about, but also just a strategy around your superannuation is hugely important because the earlier that you start, the better off that you're ultimately going to be. Warren Buffett quote, come on, Bills.
Is there something around compounding interest being the eighth wonder of the world?
Exactly right. I'm surprised that you missed the opportunity to throw Warren Buffett into the
Actually, you know what? Now that you're saying that,
don't say sponsorship.
No. I mean, look, yes, we're always open to sponsorship, but we haven't had a Warren Buffett quote in a while. We've kind of dropped the ball on that. So
me or you? This is
me. So to Mr. Buffett out there, we will try and do better moving forward. But yeah, I mean, look, on that front, it is your money, even though it is locked up and preserved. Yep. Your employer is paying 11% currently of your income into superannuation, so it's a fairly significant chunk. That's increasing over the next couple of financial years as well too, to eventually get to a rate of 12%. So it's a significant amount of money. And I think, like anything, you just need to pay attention to it and know what it is. But I mean, let's maybe strip it back to basics, Andrew, in terms of what is superannuation. We've probably spoken about this a whole heap of times anyway, but just to refresh everybody's mind and memory, what's superannuation in its simplest sense?
In its simplest form, superannuation is merely a trust. That's all superannuation is. It's money that's invested, it's in trust, and it's your money you just can't access it until you meet a condition of release, which for most people is, either turning 60 and ceasing work or turning 65. That's generally the time that most people meet a condition of release, unless you're permanently incapacitated or anything like that, or severe financial hardship. And so in essence, superannuation is an investment vehicle for you that's mandated if you're an employee, and you can't access that asset, but it still is your asset until you meet a condition of release.
Yep. So just going back to, we use some fancy terms in terms of our industry around condition of release and preservation and all that sort of stuff. Let me just strip it right back. So it's a trust that the legal system mandates that your employer has to pay money into it on your behalf at a current rate of 11% to contribute towards your future retirement. The reason why we use these fancy terms, preserve, condition of release, all of those sorts of things, basically it just means that the money is stuck in there for a significant period of time in most instances. And the reason why the system is designed like that, and the reason why it works so well, throwing back to Warren Buffett, see, we did 2 in 1 episode, but it gives the investment the period of time to be able to compound. So you want money invested in there to save for your retirement income over a long period of time. Plus, if we didn't have those rules around accessibility, most people would probably use that money or find a purpose for that money, like what we saw when the COVID release was possible. People were taking money out of superannuation and really using that as an opportunity to I guess put a deposit down on the house or just beef up their cash flow or their buffers. So that's really the reason why that's those rules are in place.
And I guess probably the most powerful thing when you're talking about superannuation, and kind of the main driver behind why superannuation is so attractive, is its tax status. So talk to us a little bit about that, Bills.
So the superannuation system, being a trust and having those rules of accessibility, preservation, also has another really powerful and important feature associated with this, and it is a concessionally taxed environment. So on the podcast, we've spoken time and time again about the benefit of superannuation from a tax perspective, especially once you've hit preservation age and once you're in retirement phase, where you can start to draw income tax-free and you can start to earn, or the money that's earned in there is also tax-free as well too. But it's a concessionally taxed environment simply because it's designed to help people increase their, retirement income down the track. So the government recognises that. They apply a concessional rate of tax of 15% on earnings. CGT is a little bit different, depending on how long you've held the asset for. But yeah, it's essentially a concessionally taxed environment, which is a great opportunity for people to be able to use it not only as a vehicle to be able to save for their retirement, but to potentially pick up some tax arbitrage opportunities with things like salary sacrificing as well.
Yeah, exactly right. And so I guess for most investments and for most environments that you're talking about investing in, superannuation is kind of it's not always the best, because you can get a 0% tax environment provided that you're, investing in someone's name that's under a tax-free threshold. But generally speaking, superannuation is the best tax environment that you're going to get. So in essence, if you're excluding, taking debt and doing, things like that to be able to leverage a position, investing in a superannuation environment is usually the best use of your funds because of that tax environment, and because your tax rate is so low within that tax environment. And then, post age 60 or 65, if being taxed at 0 is absolutely ridiculous. So being able to purchase assets and then even sell them after the age of 65 and not pay any capital gains tax is just like no other, like no other asset class. The downside of superannuation, and so this is, maybe when we're talking to people like Steve, where you've got a very, very long time frame to retirement, is you've got a fantastic tax environment. You've got the ability to compound interest. Your wealth creation within this environment is, massively beneficial, but your liquidity is pretty much as illiquid as possible, which basically means that if you need to access those funds for any reason, you can't access those funds, and you're not going to be able to access those funds unless something drastic were to happen in your life. And so you do need to balance, and as we're going through this and flushing it out with client when we're discussing this and giving personal advice, you need to consider, one, what's your cash flow requirements now? What are your intentions in the future? Because if your intentions are to, buy a property, if your intentions are to retire at the age of 50, if your intentions are to do anything outside of work until you, stop working post age 60, superannuation is not going to be the best vehicle for those funds. That's not to say that you don't do it. You might, invest heavily in superannuation and invest a small portion of your assets outside of superannuation in order to, meet age 50, draw down on your investments outside super, and then use superannuation money to, essentially retire on for the rest of your days. But the consideration for most people when you're talking about superannuation is the, inability to access those funds.
The money's locked up.
Correct.
Yeah. So I guess the way that we think through that, and I guess make a informed decision around which way to go, because it's one of those things like and I guess the same is said for investing or savings, but you're making a sacrifice today to benefit your future self at some point in the future. So it's trying to get that balance right. And I guess where we find that it gets a little bit more difficult of a consideration, and probably that's been a little bit more challenged now because of higher interest rates and higher cost of living, is going, okay, I have X amount of dollars available to do something extra with. If I put it into superannuation, that's great. I'm not going to feel the impact of that until way down the track because I'm only 39. Versus I can take that as potentially a different approach and take that and say, hey, I'm going to put that onto my mortgage, and I know I'm going to get effective rate of return, an immediate rate of return of 6%, whatever my interest rate is at that particular point in time. So it's trying to find the balance between making additional contributions to super to benefit your future self versus getting the benefit right of using that money today for something else that has a more immediate impact.
Yeah. And I think that the key word within that is balance. So most people, or not most people, but sometimes people can think very black and white, which is either, contribute to super or don't contribute to super, or salary sacrifice or don't salary sacrifice. And I think that the grey is really where most people should be playing. And it's a matter of, okay, how much do I contribute? Do I, use 60% of my surplus income, or do I only use 10% of my surplus income because I'm doing other things outside of superannuation? So having a strategy around what you're trying to achieve and where you're currently at is an important element in deciding to which extent do you fall on that seesaw.
And when I'm advising people, I'm never thinking one or the other. My starting position is always, how can we do both? And I'll give you a bit of a simple example. And this really ties into what Steve was asking us and the fact that he's asking this question so early. So as an example, if you take a mortgage out, and we'll talk about mortgage and we'll talk about super, but if you take a mortgage out and you make $50 a week in extra repayments from day one over the life of the loan, I don't have the calculations. We haven't got, a hypothetical loan amount, but you're going to be saving time and tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars on interest just by doing $50 a week for the term of the loan. If you start that early, right? So the impact of such a small amount over a long period of time is huge, as opposed to doing a larger amount later on for a shorter period of time. And I think that's the same with superannuation as well too. So Steve, from your end, if you're thinking about this, if you're starting to consider doing those types of things and you start with something small over a long period of time and taking that impact of compounding into effect, it can really have a substantial difference. So that then brings me back to my starting position is, okay, how can we do both?
Yeah.
Because if you just do,
you're putting all the eggs in one basket, you're not diversifying.
I used a pretty small figure of $50 a week of each. Like, how can we do both? What does that look like and what's the impact that it has? So yeah, I think that's just probably my own approach and my own thinking around it in terms of, can we do both as opposed to is it one or the other?
Yeah. So long term, put an amount of money in that you're not going to miss. And for most people, I mean, even if you're talking about $50 a week, yes, you're also talking about tax deductibility of contributions. So your felt impact isn't actually $50 a week. Your felt impact is probably only closer to $30 a week, depending on what taxable income you are. I guess a lot of people will spend that on a couple of lunches a week, so you wouldn't even notice it if it went away. So start small, build up over time, and look to what your long-term strategy is, because that should really be your guiding light as to how far you push the envelope in either direction.
Yeah, and talking about different tax brackets and things, Andrew, there's different incentives that the government has available depending on how much you earn. Do you want to just run us through some of those things? Because that's designed to really help people boost their superannuation balance as well.
Yeah, so what the government is ultimately trying to do with some of this stuff, which we'll touch on a couple of them, is help support people to grow their superannuation when they may not be earning a relatively high income. So if you're earning under $37,000 a year, then the government is going to give you a low income super tax offset. It's quite literally just a $500 payment or it's just a $500 payment. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to apply for it. So there's nothing in essence that you need to do to be able to get that tax offset. It's just something that will ultimately happen. However, if you're earning under, it's approximately $43,000, the government will match 50% of your after-tax contributions into super. So if you make an after-tax contribution it's up to $1,000 that you can make in after-tax contributions that the government will match for $500, but you make an after-tax contribution of $1,000 and the government will match $500 in addition to that into your super fund as well, which doesn't, for a lot of people, maybe doesn't sound hugely significant, but I'm not sure of any investments where you can get a guaranteed rate of return of 50%, which is in essence what it is.
Exactly what it is, yeah.
So it's certainly something to be considering. And if you're putting some additional money into super, your income's under $53,000, considering doing it as a non-concessional or an after-tax contribution is one way to really make the most of those funds that you're committing as well.
Yeah, and look at like what you said, it doesn't sound like a lot, but if there's an opportunity to be able to, at a particular point in time, to take advantage of that. And one of the areas I think just to highlight is that we tend to see that when new parents in particular go on parental leave and there's a gap in employment, depending on what the income is and the timing of that, there could be an opportunity to be able to get some money back from the government with the co-contribution. And it'd be nice if it was more than $500. Back in the day, it used to be $1,500. So you used to get a lot, 150% rate of return. But so that's just a nice little free kick if the stars align and that sort of looks like it in that instance around paternity leave. The other thing we tend to see as well too is if there's two members of a household and one of them is the primary breadwinner and the other one might be working part-time or staying at home doing home duties, there's also an opportunity available there as well too. So there's a few ways to look at that. But Andrew, some housekeeping things that should be taken into consideration or thought about when we are thinking around super. There's some pretty simple ones in our mind, but let's tell Steve sort of how we think about it and what they are.
Yeah, look, first one, which most people have heard of, is have one fund. Yep. If you've got multiple funds, then you usually, most funds will charge a percentage-based fee as well as an administration fee. Percentage-based fee, whether you've got, $1,000 across or $10,000 across three funds or $10,000 across one fund, shouldn't really make a difference other than the difference in the percentage of each fund. But a lot of funds also have a flat dollar amount fee. Yep. So whether that's $100 a year, a couple of $100 a year, whatever it is, the more funds that you have, the more fixed dollar amounts that you're paying. So keep costs down by having one superannuation fund. When we're talking about that, one thing that a lot of people forget to consider is most funds will have an element of insurance cover within it. Yep. So if you're consolidating funds, make sure that your insurance strategy and your coverage from an insurance perspective is essentially, fully reviewed before you roll over funds. So what I mean by that is, and I've been through many of these scenarios, you apply for insurance cover because there's a need for, either some life insurance or some income protection or anything like that. Client gets rejected from income protection insurance, let's say, because there might be some pre-existing medical conditions, but they had already rolled over 3 of their superannuations thinking they were doing the right thing into one fund, and they just cancelled either 2 or 1 insurance cover that would have covered them. And so when you consider a balancing act of, which super fund you roll into, you need to consider, both the investments within it, the cost of the fund, but also the insurance cover that's held within it. And so it may have been beneficial to, consolidate into a different fund. So make sure before you roll over any balances that you're not cancelling insurance cover that you should be holding.
Yeah, and that's a really easy one to let slip. And sort of coming back to sort of what you were referring to around the cost and the cost of the fund, making sure from a housekeeping perspective you've got sort of one fund. Where my mind tends to go with that around cost, yes, it is important, but I think from a housekeeping perspective, if you've got one, it's a lot easier to focus on and know what you've got and where you've got it. And that then ties into something that I think in the right age bracket is probably a lot more relevant. So as an example, if I had 2 funds, would I be as across the insurances that I've got? Because for me, that's much more important, having line of sight on that, feeling comfortable with that, as opposed to, saving $200 by closing down one particular fund. So I think from an admin perspective and a clarity point of view, I think that housekeeping definitely makes sense. But just driving home that insurance piece, making sure that you know what you've got and feeling comfortable enough that it is adequate for your situation is definitely critical. As a blanket statement, and I'm probably going to pee off a whole heap of people with this, but I would bet good money on it that the majority of people don't have the adequate amount of insurance or the adequate type of insurance. And it's a bit of a fallacy because you may think, yep, I'm covered, I've got insurance in my super fund, versus what's actually there and what would happen in the event that you needed to access that. And the consequences can be pretty catastrophic. So yeah, I think it's just more so of an awareness piece and just a bit of housekeeping, just so you can clean up your line of sight and get a little bit better with that.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned cost, and one thing that I do want to sort of throw into the mix with all of this, probably if you haven't paid off enough people, I'll pay off a few
Let's
more.
go for it. Why not?
There's been a very big drive towards cost of superannuation. And what I mean by that is there's been a very big push on people of low cost fund, low cost fund, low cost fund, low cost fund. And that's okay, but only when there's an absence of returns. And so what many people...
Can I just interject for a second?
Yeah, of course.
Is everybody driving a Hyundai? That's just the cheapest car I could think of. So apologies to the Hyundai drivers, right? But that's exactly it, right? Because if a vehicle is just primarily designed to provide transport with some safety attached, we've got safety standards, we'd all be driving the cheapest possible car that we could get our hands on. But we don't.
Exactly right.
Okay, I just thought that was relevant.
No, but it's...
Surely there's a Warren Buffett quote in there somewhere.
Cost is only an issue in the absence of value, right? So in the essence, or what you need to look at when you're looking at a superannuation fund is not just the cost. And I know that it's a very easy mechanism to test. And so it's simple, it's straightforward. You look at one thing and that's it. But really what needs to be considered is net rate of return. So what's the return that I'm getting from my investments and how my investments positioned, and what's the cost of the fund, which is then going to give me my, net return after costs have been subtracted from the returns, and consider your position or compare your superannuation funds from there. Considering merely on cost and only comparing on cost is just not the right approach because you're missing 50% of the equation.
And I guess that ties into investment strategy and asset allocation as well too, because there is, I guess, a lack of information or a lack of awareness out there in terms of the platform. So the badge, if that kind of makes sense, versus what's under the hood. So I guess when we talk about asset allocation investment strategy, the investments that you're invested in, a lot of the cost is derived from the underlying investments and investment options that you're invested in. So maybe we just want to talk through what that looks like a little bit for everybody, because I think that's critical. Because when you get the name of the superannuation fund, doesn't necessarily mean that, I'm investing in ABC Super. I may be investing in ABC Super where the investments are then invested in XYZ.
Yeah, correct. Most, and this sort of opens up a very wide conversation, because some funds will have very limited investment options whereby, that you can only select between a balanced, a conservative, a moderately aggressive, a high growth investment option, and they do all of the investment selection underneath it. Other funds will allow you to pick and choose your investments that are, in either direct shares or in fund managers that are, completely outside of just the fund itself. And so what Billy is trying to allude to here is, and this is probably the best example of it. Let's say I use a superannuation fund in order to purchase BHP shares. Yep. Now, whichever super fund you want to be able to, or whichever super fund you want to utilize in order to invest in BHP shares, you purchase BHP shares through Z superannuation fund or Y superannuation fund or A superannuation fund. Your investments or your return is dependent on what BHP share price does and the level of dividends that they'll ultimately provide. It does not actually make any difference who the superannuation fund provider is. And so it's really important to consider not just the provider or the intermediary that's allowing you to do the investing, but the investment options that sit underneath it. And so when we're selecting a superannuation fund, depending on, the client, depending on the strategy, depending on, the age and all of that stuff, what we're generally doing is building the investments that we want to see without considering who the fund is, because the fund doesn't actually make any difference whatsoever, but build the investments and structure the investment portfolio on how you'd like that to be structured. And then look at your cost comparisons of, okay, with, all of these maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 investment options, which super provider is going to allow me to invest in all of that? I'm going to do it for the cheapest price. Mm-hmm. Whereas most people start with who's the best fund, and it's a fallacy, because the best fund is dependent on which investment you're selecting.
Yeah. Well said. Well summarized. I reckon we could have used a whiteboard for that. So I'm itching for the business case. Maybe we just need to have a whiteboard behind us.
Exactly, so and just draw it out on the whiteboard.
Start to draw it out and stuff. But no, look, Steve, I hope that definitely helps to give you some information around some of the things that we think about in relation to superannuation, and in particular starting early, because that's probably the biggest weapon that I think you've got, or the biggest tool that you've got in your arsenal to be able to grow your retirement savings, to make sure that they're sufficient and provide the lifestyle that you want at a particular point in the future. So Andrew, thanks for the podcast. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Bills. Thanks very much. And thanks to our listeners and our viewers for tuning in. And thanks again, Steve, for the question. Really appreciate you shooting that through.
Catch you on the next one.
See ya.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about, or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
Just a reminder to our listeners that the information contained in this podcast is general in nature, and it is not intended as personal recommendations for the audience. Please consider whether the information suits your circumstances before acting on it. This information is provided by Billy Amaritis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Proprietary Limited, authorised representatives and credit representatives of AMP Financial Planning.